Welcome to Kingdom of Arakan TV.
Article 3 of Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Everyone has the right to life. Rohingya and Kaman face severe restrictions on their freedom of movement. Although in place in northern Rakhine State for decades, restrictions were tightened after 2012 and differ in severity between townships. Their stated purpose is to ensure security, but their application is disproportionate and discriminatory by exclusively targeting Muslims. Successive special rapporteurs have reported patterns of serious human rights violations of the Rohingyas' rights to life, liberty and security by state security forces and other officials. This includes summary executions, enforced disappearances, arbitrary arrests and detention, torture and ill treatment, and forced labor. CAHRC 28/72. Para 38, A67/383, Para 64.35. Following the 2012 violence, OHCHR received credible reports of the arbitrary arrest and detention of hundreds of Rohingya, including women and children, and consistent allegations of torture and ill treatment. This included severe beating, burning by cigarettes, burning of beards, forced labor, sexual humiliation and abuse, denial of medical treatment, degrading conditions of detention and deaths in custody. The indiscriminate nature and scale of arrest and detention without due process and the subsequent treatment in detention has raised concerns of collective punishment. In northern Rakhine State, the arbitrary arrest and detention of Rohingya remains widespread. Their statelessness leaves them particularly vulnerable and a target for extortion. Arrests are often carried out without grounds, formal processing, or laying charges, until release is secured by payment of a bribe. OHCHR has received reports of violence, forced entrance and search of homes, confiscation of property, extortion and excessive use of force related to arrest. Inability to pay onerous bribes can lead to violence, detention or retributive action against the victim's relatives. For those formally charged, fair trial guarantees are often not respected. OHCHR has received reports of sexual violence, including rape, against women who have been arrested or detained, or in the course of law enforcement operations, such as house searches or at checkpoints. OHCHR has no information that such allegations have been investigated or perpetrators held accountable. Rohingya and Kaman communities face a disproportionate burden due to discriminatory barriers, including freedom of movement restrictions, which severely impact the right to health. This is particularly acute regarding access to emergency and life-saving care. OHCHR has received credible reports of deaths due to the inability to access health facilities or treatment in time, often where there was a township hospital in close setup. R2, 36-9 AHRC 32/18. 37 in townships surrounding Setwood, including Portor and Myanmar, Muslims cannot freely access township hospitals. Emergency cases must be referred to Setwood General Hospital through an onerous and time-consuming referral process, which includes the need for boat travel and police escorts. Muslim patients are restricted to a segregated ward where allegations and rumors of discriminatory treatment persist. This leads to a general reluctance to receive care at the facility. In northern Arakan, patients can access township hospitals but are required to obtain costly and time-consuming travel authorizations, pass through checkpoints, and face additional limitations imposed by the curfew. This can cause serious and life-threatening delays in emergency situations. Delays in seeking or receiving emergency obstetric treatment have particularly devastating consequences and can be a major cause of death of babies and for women experiencing complications during pregnancy and childbirth. Thousands of Rohingya have been arrested and detained by government officials without due process and without the legal protections of a fair trial. The habits of lower and major ranks from militaries and police bullying, torturing, laboring and harassing ethnic Rohingya without having a good reason but because ethnic Rohingyas are recognized as color outsider to Burmese militaries and Rakhine government. In February and April 2019, Refugees International interviewed Rohingya who had arrived in Bangladesh from Myanmar just days before. Those interviewed described ongoing harassment, arbitrary detention, and forced labor at the hands of Myanmar's security forces. For example, more than 120,000 Rohingya have been living in displacement camps since 2012 in what the UN has described as deplorable conditions. The government's plans to close the camps have resulted in little more than shifting the displaced to structures next to the camps with no greater degree of freedom of movement or opportunity to return to their lands of origin. In an interview with HRW at the security Tedkipayan camp in Situ township where Rohingya Muslims have been confined since 2012, there is no future there, Hamida says. Do you think only tube wells and shelters inside the camp is enough to live our lives? We couldn't go to market to get the items we needed, couldn't eat properly, couldn't move freely anywhere. We were in turmoil 24 hours a day. Myanmar authorities meanwhile have enabled a culture of threats and violence that instills fear and self-imposed constraints. The central Rakhine camps violate international human rights law and contravene international standards on the treatment of internally displaced persons, IDPs, which provide that displaced populations shall not be interned in or confined to a camp. These violations are so severe that these camps cannot accurately be considered IDP camps at all, but rather open-air detention camps. Living conditions in the 24 camps and camp-like settings are squalid, described in 2018 as beyond the dignity of any people by then United Nations Assistant Secretary General Ursula Mueller. Severe limitations on access to livelihoods, education, healthcare, and adequate food or shelter have been compounded by increasing government constraints on humanitarian aid, which Rohingya are dependent on for survival. International Rescue Committee IRC, a humanitarian organization working in the camps, found that tuberculosis rates are 9 times higher in the camps than in the surrounding Rakhine villages. The 1973 Apartheid Convention applies to inhumane acts committed for the purpose of establishing and maintaining domination by one racial group of persons over any other racial group of persons and systematically oppressing them. Apartheid and persecution are also crimes against humanity under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. In summary, above explanations is briefly enough to understand how Burmese militaries and Rakhine government ignoring, abusing and against international laws, conventions, treaties, dignities and signatories. Ethnic Rohingya needs your help and urgent United Nations peacekeepers to repatriate back ethnic Rohingya refugees back to their homeland with safety, dignity and long-term solutions for international crisis and victims' safety inside their own home, properties and land inside Arakan, Burma, Myanmar.